Hello, thank you for joining us today and welcome to this Hasselblad webinar. I hope you're all keeping safe in these tough times and are looking forward to spending the next hour with us. I'm Mark Whitney, part of Hasselblad's marketing team, and I'm coming to you today from the United Kingdom. I'm also joined by my colleague, Chris Cooze, who is Hasselblad's Global Technical Communications Manager. And today's webinar is the second in a new series of which we're calling the Phocus Q&A webinars. The Phocus Q&A webinars are designed to be driven by you, the audience. To be held on a regular basis, you are able to suggest a question or topic during the registration process for us to then consider covering during the webinar, and we'll select the most requested or relevant topics for Chris to then talk through during the webinar. Last month, we covered the import process, working with third-party files, local corrections and reproduction mode, and we did have some of the same topics suggested again for this webinar. So if you did miss the first Phocus Q&A webinar, you may wish to find a recording on the Hasselblad YouTube channel. So speaking of which, this webinar is also being recorded. So if you'd like to watch this webinar back or any of our previous webinars over the past year and a bit, please go to the Hasselblad YouTube channel and you can find them all on there. We hope to be able to get the recording of this webinar up within a few hours of the webinar, or worst case tomorrow morning. Just before we carry on with the webinar, just another little reminder that the closing date for the Hasselblad Masters is fast approaching, the end of the month. So if you haven't already entered and you plan to, please make sure to get your entry in before the closing date of the 31st of July. And we look forward to receiving your submissions. So today, as I said, these are topics suggested by you, the audience. And we've got 4 topics today. So one is Phocus versus Lightroom. We've had many questions on what are the differences between using the two, what are the sort of key benefits and the advantages of using each piece of software. So Chris is going to run through that. Then cropping. We've had a few questions with regards to how in-camera cropping works, all the different crop modes we've got, and how that then follows through to the software. So Chris will again run through that. Camera calibration, why to calibrate your camera, or when, and how to do it. And then also output presets. Now, this was specifically asked with regards to preparing output files for print, but Chris is actually going to expand that a little bit more because presets can be used for a variety of different uses. So again, that's another topic we will cover. We hope this will be around about 50 minutes in length, which will give us some time for some Q&A. Please only ask questions that are relating to today's topics. If you have any other questions off topic on Phocus, please save them and register for the next webinar that we're doing. And that will be the 25th of August. It's already up on the Hasselblad website. So please visit there after the webinar and ask any questions that you have that aren't already covered in today's webinar or in the previous webinar. So Chris, how are you?
Yep, good, thank you, Mark.
I'll just throw the presentation over to you.
Perfect. So hopefully you can see my screen if the technology is working.
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so let's make a start on the biggest requested one. We're going to talk briefly about key benefits really of Phocus, then we'll look at Lightroom, and then we'll look at what is a suggested hybrid type workflow. So if we look at the main key items for Phocus, obviously being Hasselblad software, it fully integrates from the camera through to the final image in terms of the color control through the natural color solution. So Phocus actually is the best way of keeping that Hasselblad color and color space control all the way through to your final exported image. The tethering, the tools within Phocus itself, capture sequencer, the bracketing controls, the actual live view control, focus control. It's a really simple and generally pretty stable experience shooting tethered, be it a H system, an X system. Full tethered shooting is relatively straightforward and easy. Dynamic lens corrections. The key thing here for Phocus in comparison, let's say for Adobe products, is that in Phocus, the lens corrections are fully dynamic, so they take into account what's your focus distance, the focal length being used. You know, if it's a zoom lens, it's not just picking a wide, a middle, and an end, it's the exact focal length. The aperture in use, all of these things are taken into account. Now, that also includes if you've got adapters on it. For instance, with the H system, if you're using the HTS tilt shift converter, if you're using the 0.8 converter on the X system to mount a H lens, all of those are taken into account when the lens corrections are actually applied on import. Some of the things you have no choice, to be honest. Multi-shot cameras currently can only be used through Phocus to actually process the 4 shots or 6 shots and then output a high resolution TIFF at the end. Same goes for Hasselblad raw video processing. Phocus allows you to take the footage straight off the card, process it through, and then output it so that you can then do your final cuts in Final Cut or Premiere Pro, depending on which is your preferred workflow. If you're also using Phocus Mobile 2 on an iPad or iPhone, any modifications obviously you do on the iPad, your rating information, but more importantly your edits and so on. Once those files are then ported across to the Phocus desktop app, all of those corrections can actually be automatically imported, and you're starting from where you left off on the iPad. A couple of extra ones. For those that use tilt shift or work with mixed lighting and want to level that out, then the scene calibration mode gives you a quick and simple way of basically evening out the lighting and correcting for casts. Camera calibration, so we're going to look at that later on today. So that's built in for a closed loop. Obviously, you can use third-party software by exporting the targets as well. But for a quick and easy way of doing things, there is the calibration generator. The moire detection, so automatic correction, plus, if required, a local adjustment. And then for those that need more control or want to work on files that have literally no image tweaks done to them, then there's the reproduction mode where you can get the linear and negative response curves, which we looked at recently in the reproduction webinar. And I suppose it's not a feature, if you like, but the software is actually free to download, so there's no limit on number of installations and no cost for it. If we now look across to Lightroom, I suppose that the biggest benefit is that once you import your images, you're working on a full catalog functionality. So for keywording, search facilities, and so on, it's much quicker, much easier to control through Lightroom. In fact, obviously, Phocus itself has no catalog, so it's purely working through, the Finder or Windows Explorer type controls. A biggie for a lot of people is third-party plugin support. That could be, for black and white, say something like Silver Effects Pro, something like that, or skin softening, or many different third-party plugins. A big one for a lot of people, and we looked at recently with the confusion it sometimes causes. Lightroom doesn't care whether it's a 3FR or a 3F Hasselblad RAW file. So whether it's been imported to Phocus or not, Lightroom doesn't care. It will then apply its own version of color profile and lens corrections to these RAW files, but it can't read any corrections that are actually within the Hasselblad files. It's pretty much a blank canvas for it to work on. The other benefits really from Lightroom would be the additional tools there. So website connections, social media, many options there within the different tools and tabs. And obviously a big one is integration with the Adobe product range. For most people, that will be exporting files for edit to within Photoshop, and those files are then being directly ported back into Lightroom and added to the catalog. virtual copy options there. Previously, we looked at how you could achieve pretty much the same thing within Phocus, but it's not quite as slick by using save states. But with virtual copies within Lightroom, you can compare side by side very quickly. You know, original file, edited file. And file sharing. Phocus does not use XML files. We store all information actually within the header of our file. The problem with that is that currently very few, if any, I think third-party applications can read that information. So if I was using Lightroom and I wanted to export the file, I can make sure Lightroom creates the XML sidecar file, and then that raw plus the XML means that another program would be able to read the corrections you've made. Also, if you're already using Lightroom, or should we say an Adobe workflow, then you may want to add a Hasselblad camera to an existing flow. So if you're already using, I don't know, a Canon, a Nikon, and you've added an X1D2, let's say, to your workflow, this means that the camera can be seamlessly added into that workflow, which makes life a little bit easier. You don't have to learn another application, as it were. So I suppose to sum up, the key differences really, obviously the color handling, the lens corrections and so on, and the tethered shooting, whether or not that's a big requirement for you. Phocus Mobile 2 integration, all of those are big points for Phocus. But depending on your workflow, you might find the Adobe Lightroom one with the catalogs, the third-party plugins and so on, more, should we say, enticing to you. Now, a way that, I personally use this, but a combined workflow, trying to use the best points of both pieces of software. And so you take your captures, you import them into Phocus as we've looked at before. You do your raw editing as much as possible within Phocus. So keystone, lens corrections, your scene correction for local calibration and so on, possibly even using reproduction mode. So you're getting the best finish and best color that you can within Phocus from that raw file. We then export those files as 16-bit TIFFs, but the most important thing here would be when we export that we select the source as the output profile. That then embeds into your 16-bit TIFF, the Hasselblad RGB or L-Star RGB color space, your working profile. And so that then, if you like, builds in the Hasselblad color and output, which can then be used by Lightroom or Photoshop. So you would then import those files into Lightroom. They would pick up the fact that the Hasselblad RGB profile is embedded, and actually when you look at the profile used or open it with, look at the file information in Lightroom or Photoshop, it will come up as embedded. Once you've got it in, you're using the Hasselblad as your Hasselblad color as your working space. You can then use all of your plugins and other correction software that you want to use. Plus, obviously, you probably output it into Photoshop and do your various additional layers and adjustments. All of those then are still working within the Hasselblad color space. And then finally, when you finish, you would then output your TIFF, JPEG, whatever you need. But that way you've extracted the maximum amount of quality all the way through, working from Phocus to get the best from the raw, then using the cataloging, keywording, etc. functionality of Lightroom, virtual copies for your comparing, possibly using Photoshop, and then finally then ended up with your fully corrected output file only at the last minute, then converting to maybe sRGB or whatever you need to send to your photo lab or upload to the web. So that's a way of actually like a hybrid workflow, using both pieces of software and pulling, if you like, the best parts of each. That's probably the best way to move forward from that. Obviously, if you've already got an existing workflow that with another camera system, then fully understand that maybe just sticking to Lightroom or Bridge and Photoshop is maybe a simpler way to do it. Okay. We're now going to move on and look very quickly here at camera calibration. It's easier to show you the what's necessary actually within the software once we get there. The first point to mention really would be that when we actually produce the camera, each individual sensor is set up and calibrated and adjusted within the factory. And so we end up with an individual camera calibration for each unit. It's not a de facto 50 megapixel sensor, here's a calibration file. It's very specific to each individual sensor. And we're looking for, dead pixels, hot pixels, that type of thing. It's all built into that. Obviously, there are those users that need, if you like, full control of the color. They don't want anything done to the image. And so, museums, archives, that type of thing, or when you're using specific lighting setups and you're trying to control a balance, or maybe you've got multiple cameras that are in use in a department that are trying to be balanced so they all match across the range of cameras. So we fully understand there are those that want to create their own camera calibrations, and that could be in conjunction with reproduction mode or just updating very simply the standard camera calibration. So within Phocus, there is the option to actually create that. Now, you have to select a target, and it's quite important, depending on what you're photographing and what color space you're going to be working in, which target you're going to use. For most of us, well, just, if you like, double checking and correcting for maybe mixed lighting and so on, something like the color checker is more than enough with 24 patches. And obviously they're contained pretty much within the sRGB color space. So if they're mainly web work, that type of thing, color checker is fine. If you move to something like an SG chart, many more patches, but more importantly, they extend beyond the edges of the sRGB. So you're into wider color gamut. That patch will just give you a little bit more confidence in terms of the color gamut control. To access the color control, we just need to bring up the reproduction tool. Obviously, working space we've looked at before, but here you'll have the Hasselblad RGB, or if you were to hit the pull down, there's the L-Star RGB if you want a very wide gamut color space to work in. But what we're looking at today is the color calibration. Now, by default, it says factory. If you click the pull down, the edit option is here. So we're assuming at this point that you've taken images of your color chart within the setup that you're currently using. And so you have your color chart. Okay, we have quite a few color charts in this test image, sorry, which confuses the issue a little bit. But effectively from the pull down here, we would select color checker or SG or DG or DC. And then once we've selected the chart, we can hit auto locate and it will then find that chart in the image. If it doesn't quite work, you can then drag the corners to find the chart and then hit calibrate. It will then give you a delta E in terms of a maximum error and an average error. If you wish to use an external piece of software to actually create that profile, that's perfectly okay. In this case, you would probably use the reproduction or the reproduction linear, which ensures you're outputting a capture from the camera with almost no corrections at all from the Hasselblad software. It just comes out as a straight capture with just the sensor calibration information applied to it. You would then create an output preset, which is obviously what we're going to look at later. And the most important point here is that the output profile is set to source. This means there's no color gamut changes, there's no conversions going to take place. It comes out within the selected Hasselblad color space. Then you'd hit OK to export that, export the image, process the file, and then once we've processed the file, we then need to bring that ICC profile back to the computer and physically add it to the profile folder. So once that's then into the computer, once we start Phocus, automatically it will scan for those profiles, and we go back to the reproduction tool, and our externally created profile will be listed here, and we would just select that then instead of the factory option. That will then apply that profile when we process the image captures. It's very important here that you select the same working space as when you exported the image. That way everything matches up. So that was very quick through camera calibration, because we're going to actually physically do it in a moment in the Phocus software. It's a lot easier to see it in action. Cropping. So there's three types of cropping that you're going to run into within Phocus. The first one is an in-camera crop. Now, in this case, I've shot with a 1:1 crop. When the image originally opens in Phocus, you'll see a square. If we hit the crop tool, which is the orange icon here, automatically you will see the full image and the cropped area that the camera has automatically cropped for you. So no matter what crop ratio you choose in camera, it will always capture the full image and then encode the crop area automatically into the file. So it's always possible to go back to a full image, and it's also possible to move that crop. You know, if it wasn't quite where you wanted it, you can then move the crop around to the area that you want. The second that you're likely to run into would be if you're using a HCD lens on a H system or an X camera with a converter. Because the HCD lenses don't quite fully cover the 645 format or the 53x40 sensor, within Phocus there's an auto crop option. And so when it picks up it's a HCD lens, it will automatically crop. You can see roughly the amount there. It would be simpler when I'm in the software to see it. So this is the amount that it crops. It's up to you. You can keep the crop, you can remove the crop, you can reduce the amount of crop, but that is the safe area cropped off for full illumination. It's then down to you to look at the image to see whether you want to keep that or it's perfectly acceptable to go to the edge of the files. And then obviously there's the in-app crop. So this is just us cropping down an image that we're working on. We can select a particular ratio and so on, and then as we drag, it will show us the new cropped area. So when we're doing what I would class as a standard crop, few little tools here. So constrain allows us to select particular cropping ratio. You can add new presets to your own particular ratio. So for instance, if you wanted to put in a, let's say a Instagram ratio of 1.9 to 1, that type of thing, you could put that in, no problem. If you select none, which is default, it's just a free-form selection. Additionally, you have this little tick box, allow crop outside. Now, once we look at the software, we'll see that once you do, let's say, a keystone style correction where you're correcting for converging verticals, etc., you may want to move the crop area across the edge of the image so that you're effectively you're taking an area that has no image in it. By making sure that box is ticked, you've got free control over where you move the cropped area box. Okay, output presets. Within the output presets that come with the software, there's quite a few. I mean, you can see here, the little H's down the side are actually the default ones that are supplied with the software. And then when you create your own, they just appear here with relevant names. But in terms of the parameters that you can choose for an output preset, different file types, obviously, and you can choose, within a TIFF, it can be 8-bit, 16-bit, PSD is the same. Then you can choose, do you want to just scale down the whole of an image? Do you want it half resolution, or do you want to constrain the ratio or a particular resolution, pixel size? And obviously the output profile. So this is populated by pretty much the color profiles you have installed on your computer system. So we're going to talk generally about a lab preset. If I was going to be sending files to a pro lab or printing lab, looking at what they would require. Now, they normally have on their websites some very specific instructions about what's going to be required to send them files. So generally, depending on the output type that you're going for, if it's something like silver halide printer, then it's likely to be an 8-bit output. Obviously, if you're sending to an Epson wide format, that type of thing is what you're asking for. It could be a wider bit depth. They'll also specify the color space that you can send them. Generally, sRGB is perfect, some Adobe RGB, depending on the lab again, and then the file type, whether it's JPEG, TIFF, etc. They'll also give you a resolution that they recommend for the particular printer that you're sending to for the print that you've asked for. And normally they'll specify, 200, 300 pixels per inch, that type of resolution. And so we can take that information and we can then create an output preset with exactly that information. So we choose the file format based on what they've said. We can choose the dimensions control, or generally it's going to be full size, and then importantly the output profile. So in this case, if they've asked for sRGB or Adobe RGB, we just select that here. So very straightforward. We select the edit option from output preview, and then we click the plus, and then we just do the basics. So give it a name in terms of the preset, choose your format, choose your PPI, full size or restricted dimensions, and then the output profile. Now, obviously in this case, we've just been speaking about a lab, but if I was setting up, for a website or maybe something for Instagram or Facebook, you can create output presets for those as well, no problem. And that's what we'll look at. In terms of when we're physically finished correcting a file and we're going to export it, what we can do is select the image or a group of images, and then the presets that we've just set, we can select here. So output preset, there's a little drop down. You select the preset that you want. So all of those changes that are required for either the lab or your website, whatever, are always already built in. Next job really then is to choose your naming preference and then click export. If it's 1 file, 10 files, it will just then work its way out to wherever you've selected those files to go. However, Phocus has a little trick. There is an additional output option, okay, which will then open up a secondary output box. You can then hit the output preset here. So for instance, if I was outputting a full size 16-bit TIFF for my archive that I want to keep as my master file, but I want to create maybe an Instagram post, or I want to create an output file for my website page, I can select that as a secondary output here. So again, I just choose the second output, and what happens is the first output gets processed. Immediately afterwards, you get the second output process. And again, it's up to you whether you want it into the same folder, into a different folder that you're using. But it will just, for each file you've selected for output, it will do both processes. Okay, just makes life a little bit easier. You know, if for each file you maybe have a master file and a web post and so on. So that's enough talk. Now I'm going to now swap over to Phocus. And we'll work through all of those items we've just covered. Okay, so in terms of camera calibration, so with that particular, I'm just going to show you reproduction mode, and if I float this particular tool here, hopefully you can see there's the two options there in terms of RGB, L-star RGB, and you can see here we've got factory, standard. If I now move to a file that has a target in it, I can now create a calibration file using this target. And it could be, in this case, an SG, or it could be, in this case, it's a color checker 24 patch target. And the simplest way here is click on factory and you'll see the edit option. If we click edit, previous calibrations are here. I can click plus, and then I can give this calibration we're about to create a name, a time. It was something that makes sense. I'll just leave this as time and date here. I then select the type of target. So in this case, it's a color checker. And then I ask it to auto-locate. It looks for the corners. If there's a problem, you can manually drag each of these patches to set the outer limits of the target, and then the system will then work out the patches in between. Once you're happy with that, you hit calibrate, and then it gives you an average delta E and a maximum. If you move the slider, you can see which patches are failing or causing the high readings here. I can tell from mine, because I've not done any of the calibrations to the image, that the white patches are slightly too light. So something around 2 for your maximum. I mean, in this case, average is 1.2 is pretty good, but the white patch here is a little bit too high, 2.8. So if I could get that towards 2, that would be perfect. Once you're happy with what's there, you click create. Then your calibration is added to the list. Obviously, you can see giving it a proper name and relevance makes it much easier to actually find the file. Then you click done. To use that calibration, all we need to do is select the calibration we've just made from the list, and that's automatically used instead of, or should we say, in addition to the factory calibration. So the sensor data in terms of dead pixels and so on is still applied, but the actual color calibration is from our calibration here. The other thing to note, when you open reproduction mode, you need to make sure here, obviously, depending on what you're trying to achieve, you choose the correct one. So if I choose standard, Hasselblad RGB, and then click edit, just to show you the differences that this could actually do. Color checker, auto locate. There you go. It's picked it up. Done. Done. So in this case, I'm then using the standard response, and you saw the change in image in terms of more contrasty and so on. If I go back to reproduction, you'll see it lighten up. So all of the normal corrections are taken off. Okay. Now that's great for a very simple in-system closed loop color calibration. But I say there are those that want fuller control over the color response of the camera, and would probably be using something like an SG color chart. And so for this, we capture the target, and we then just launch that again, choose our color space, and we make sure we pick either reproduction or reproduction low gains is the current favorite, to be honest, if you're making an external profile. So that's literally, you have no corrections at all, no linear, no gain corrections for the sensor at all. So then same process, we can create an output file from that if we wish. But for most people, if they're using a third-party profile generator like Profile Maker, something like that, this is basically all we need to set. So we leave it on low gain, and now when we export, if I just show you quickly, I have a profile set up. So effectively, I have a preset for profile. So I have a 16-bit TIFF, full size obviously, and the output profile is source. So that means the Hasselblad color space that you selected within reproduction mode is embedded in that. That will then come through. You'll put it through Profile Maker after you export the file. And again, once we've loaded the profile, reproduction mode, and in this case, we make sure the working space is the same, and we choose our new profile from this list. Okay. So that's very quick on camera calibration.
I just got
going to say, go on.
Yeah, sorry, Chris. A couple of quick questions before we go to the next category. So we've got a question from Stephen. Do you need to neutralize on the chart and set black and white values before you calibrate? So with the test shot you've got there.
Yeah. So for me, I think in terms of the black and white extremes, generally, if you're in a studio environment, you can just make sure that the lighting is nice and even for the scenario you're shooting in. But at the very least, you would select the neutral tool and then, or pick a tool, and then neutralize on one of the gray patches. So you click that, and there you go. It's pretty, as you can see, it's pretty good. Okay. But again, before you do that, it's important to select your working space that you want, whether you're going to go for the wide gamut or whether you're going to go for the standard working space, and also your reproduction mode. So whichever, whether you're going to use in camera, in software for that closed loop, or if you're going to use third party, before you start adjusting the image, you need to make sure you've selected your preferred response correction. So the standard is obviously what everybody uses for generic photography, but if you're making profiles for use with external software, then you would probably use reproduction or low gain. Yeah. Okay. And then once you've selected that, then you neutralize.
Okay. And I think you may have just answered the second question as well. So John just wanted to confirm that you should use the same color space and reproduction that the calibration is created with.
Yeah, you have to do that. Otherwise, it will be mismatch in terms of, once you go to the extremes, it'll do some real strange things.
Okay, that's it for that topic at the moment, if you want to carry on.
Okay, yep, cool. So then, going to look at crop now. Just go back to pre-file. So, going to show that HCD lens crop, because this is the simplest, easiest one to look at straight away. So here's my file that I'll get when I've imported the images from the camera or from the SD card. When I then hit the crop tool down here, automatically it shows the cropped area from the actual full capture. Okay. Now, it's quite a bit of crop off that image, to be honest. And that's because it's designed to cover an area of the smaller 48 by 39 type sensor. So it just means that you've not got those extremes. Now, to be honest, most of the extreme corners are generally pretty good, but they just are being safe. Now, if I click outside that area, you can see the crop disappears and I've got the full captured area. And you can then check for yourself. If I look then up into the corners, I can then decide whether or not I feel the, just let it redraw. You know, I can check that the quality is good enough for what I'm trying to use. If it is, then no problem, I can use the whole image. Otherwise, I can just keep the crop or make it slightly less cropped. But it's just to make sure you know that, you know, if you're using a HCD lens, even on an X camera, you can override that auto crop. If I then move to in-camera crop, so you know there's lots and lots of options now. If I shoot with my X1D2, you know I've got everything from 16:9, 1:1, many options for it. So you can see here I've got a square image that was captured with an X camera using an XCD45, which was great. That's what I wanted. If I now go to the crop tool, you can still see the square, but I can see what I missed. You know, the whole image has been captured. And if I want to, I can think, actually, I would prefer in this case a bit more of the ceiling, or maybe I don't like the crop and I can click to get rid of it and put a different crop on it. So it just gives you full capability. So yes, if you choose to crop in camera, and obviously the camera itself will show you the area being captured, plus outside of the masks that you can see, if you change the opacity, even in the camera, you can see what's being captured and what's not in terms of for your crop, so you can move it around. This just gives you the best flexibility. Okay. And then standard crop. If I can get it to change. So here's my full image. If I hit crop, click outside. There we go. And I'll just put that back to 0 so we can see. So this was the image out of the camera. And so with the crop tool, hopefully you can all see that. A couple of useful features. Let's say crop outside we'll look at in a second. Then with the crop ratio, the constraint ratio, by default it's none. Obviously, if you've selected 1:1 or something previously when working on the image, it does remember that. But none means it's a freeform crop. I can drag the area that I want. Otherwise, I can just choose my ratio. And as I said previously, if you want to, you can create your own crop constraint here. So I could have 1.9 Insta, just as an example. So 1.9 to 1, let's say. And then there's my 1.9 Insta crop. If I now click and drag, you can see what I'm getting. Okay. Again, once you've clicked and dragged, you can then move the corners. Again, providing there's room, and I can move that around. Okay. Also, if you notice, when I'm dragging, there are grid lines that are showing on the image. Now, you can modify the number of grid lines that show. If I've still got the hand click to move the crop, if I now press 1 to 9 on the keyboard, so if I go to 7 or 3, I can change the number of grid lines that show, which may or may not help me in terms of alignment. I'm just going to go to none, just to prove to you that now effectively here, this gives me a full freeform crop. Additionally, you have the masks tool. Now I've modified this to be a light masked area, but depending on the type of image, if you've got a very bright image, you actually might want, if you click the mask, you can change the color density just so it's easier to see what's being masked and what's not. Okay, if you don't like a crop, all you need to do is click in the masked area and it's back to full area and you can start again. The final section on cropping, if I just turn off the crop tool. So there's my corrected image, but maybe I'm not quite happy with the crop on that because of the keystoning effect. Once you turn on the crop tool, if you see here, you can see the full modified image. So you can see the keystoned, rotated, twisted image that had been carried out on my, should we say, image where I had converging verticals. So the keystone correction is there, but it means that certain areas of the image are obviously not able to get. If I don't like the position of this, so say for instance here, I'm losing the top of the tower, I might prefer to move the cropped area to get the maximum I can. And then when I finish and output this image, I could fill in the basic blue sky in Photoshop, something like that, just to fill it in, but I've got the maximum amount of corrected image. So this is what the allow crop outside means. Just allows you to basically put that crop box anywhere you like, even if it means there's no image in it. So as you can see there, I've actually got no image in that top section. So that's your basic crop controls. Is that okay, Mark?
Yeah, that's all good. There's no questions on that, so you explained it very well.
Okay. Yeah. Right then, so let's now move on to presets. If I just go back to standard file, you then have output preview. So I'm just going to float that so it's in the middle of the screen. It's sort of easier to see. So within the output preview tool, as we said earlier, there are some basic TIFFs, JPEGs, PSD setups. And if you select one of the predefined presets, say TIFF 16, it then tells you in this little window here, basically, in this case, pixels and how big that file will be. So 16-bit gives me a 577 with this particular file because it's off 100 megapixel H6D. If I wanted to see physical size that would print to, I could put it into inches or centimeters, whatever's easiest. Obviously, if I change that to basic TIFF, the file size comes down, but the output size remains the same. Okay. Now, with the example we used earlier, was the ProLab. Basically, within that, we can now define our own. If I choose Edit, here we have the option to define our own preset. So again, the H1s are the fixed ones, you can't change them. But if I hit the plus, I can now say, I don't know, website, create a page for that, let's say. It would be even better if I could spell today. I can then choose my desired file format. So it may be that it's going to be a JPEG file. Obviously, if I choose JPEG, it then asks me what quality do you want, PPI rating, and then size. So it may be that I have a size restriction on my website in terms of number of pixels or physical megabyte sizes and so on. And so I can then specify a percentage. So it may be that I want, a quarter size of my original file, or it could be a specific pixel size that I need, in which case I can enter in a height and a width. We then have the output profile. So by default, generally you'll have Adobe RGB, sRGB Pro Photo. Source, as we've already discussed, means it's the Hasselblad natural color solution embedded profile, or there may be another profile that you want to use. So if this is website, let's assume it's going to be sRGB. Once we're happy with that, we click OK. That is then now in our output list. Okay, very straightforward. Once I've finished editing my image, I now have the option of export. Very straightforward here. You choose firstly, where do you want the file to go? So in this case, I'm going to say desktop. My output preview, or sorry, output preset is here. If I wish, I can choose a different one. And using the edit button, I can actually go back into the preset setup and modify it if I wish. We then have, how do you want it named? Do you want the date? Do you want full raw name? So whatever works for you. It could be full raw. So this would just basically give me, if it was a numbered file, it would give me the number. Or the date and a sequence number. If I've got 50 files and I want them starting from number 1, number 10, whatever, I just put my required starting number. Let's say number 1, and then hit export. Once I do that, down in the bottom corner, the system will tell me how many frames are remaining if I've exported multiple, and that will count down until it's finished. Additionally, you'll notice we have do nothing after export, and we have additional output. So as I discussed in the presentation, the additional output allows me to create a second file straight away. So I could choose Insta or a website file, whatever I'm after. So in this case, let's say it's the landscape. And again, probably with this, I will choose that. And in this case, I'm going to start it from 10. This would then create a second file in the same folder as my full size file, which would then be useful for maybe for, as I say, a social media post or something like that. While we're here, additionally, the do nothing after export option allows you to open it in a specified editor. So within the preferences, you could set up a path to, let's say, Photoshop, or you can ask it to open a Finder window, or on a Windows machine, obviously a Windows Explorer window comes up, and it will show you where that file is in terms of your within your file system. Then hit export, and it will then give me 2 files. Okay. Right, I think that's the basics there, unless people are asking for something on the presets, Mark.
Yes, so we've got a question from Roland. He's saying that his prints look normal on the screen, but come out dark, saturated, and high contrast. Can he set preset values for these parameters as an output profile without being able to match the picture on the screen to the print? He's having to guess at what corrections to apply. Is there a fix for that or suggestion?
Yeah, first thing I'd ask would be, is your screen calibrated? Because that is a real biggie generally, is to make sure that your editing screen that you're using is correctly calibrated. Once you're happy with that, then you know that's a known good. And then you definitely know that anything that's wrong with your print output is definitely then your print driver settings or something like that. Normally you would try to modify then the output through your print driver and put a color correction or a fixed setting in there to offset what's wrong. If you really wanted to, if you knew that, from whatever it looks on screen, let's say your prints are coming out 2 stops dark or something like that, as an example, what you could do is then create a correction preset. So we've just looked at output presets. Okay, all they do is modify the size of the file, and the conversion from existing Hasselblad space to another profile space. If we want to change things like exposure or contrast, that type of physical image control, then we need to create a adjustment preset. So if I quickly pop to the adjustments browser, okay, within this, it tells me what my current corrections are for this particular image. So it tells me I've got an exposure value change, and it tells me I've got lens corrections turned on. So with this then, I could say, right, I know my images are going to come out 2 steps too dark, so I can then correct here and create, let's say, another jump to 2 here to make the image, it looks overly bright on screen, but I know that that will help correct when the printer comes out, should we say. And then you then have, if you notice this has been updated to 2, I can then create a correction. So if you notice that we have different tabs, so we have factory, we have user, we have embedded, and we have current. If I go to current and click plus, come on. So this correction here, if I click save, so I need to click save at the top here first. So that saves my change. I then click embedded here. This is what we're currently on, okay? And I can now create a new setting. It's basically same as my factory setting, my user setting here, okay? If I go back to current, copy to user, and then it automatically in user, let's say it's print density correction. Yep. Print correction. Just so we know what it is. Okay. If I now click on any other file, so let's go for this one. Within the adjustments browser, under user, we have print correction. So I can get my image looking how I like it. I then click on print correction and click load. And that automatically applies the exposure changes that I have worked out I needed to that image. So it will look awful on screen because I've added, maybe reduced contrast. I've added maybe 2 stops of overexposure, but that theoretically would then correct for your printer. I have to say, I personally would be looking to check my screen calibration to make sure that that's good, and then double check my print driver settings. If I've got that much mismatch between what the printer's given me and the screen, I would then check those in that order. Screen first, then print driver, make sure the settings are correct, make sure I've not got additional saturation turned on and so on within the print driver, and then start controlling it that way, and then only minor tweaks from an adjustment. Hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, hopefully that helps, Roland. We're just running a little bit, but just a few other quick questions before we go. These were submitted before the webinar, so we always try and pick a couple of quick questions we could just squeeze in at the end that aren't included in the main topics. So Fred from Thailand is asked, is Phocus fully compatible with the latest Mac OS for MacBook Pro and all other mobile devices? So this is a question we get quite a lot.
Yeah, so this is normally about like the M1, the new Apple Silicon, and yes, Phocus will work quite happily on the latest OSs and on Apple Silicon, no problem.
Okay, and then a question from Andy in the UK. He's bought an iPad 2020. How quick do the files sync over to the iPad on Wi-Fi, and how does that compare then to wired tethered capture?
Okay, so I'm assuming we're talking a Phocus Mobile 2 workflow here. So
yeah,
if you're tethered and you're talking about a USB-C connection, just to give you a reference, it's a fraction of a second, 0.2, 0.3 of a second for an X1D2 50 megapixel capture to transfer from the camera as a RAW into your iPad. Obviously, if you've got an older iPad, that may be slightly longer. But to give an example, if you're shooting Wi-Fi tethered, by default, Phocus Mobile 2 will transfer a small 1.5, 2 megabyte preview file for every capture to enable you to shoot quickly. And again, it's half a second or so for this preview file to come across on Wi-Fi. If you then think, okay, I want to see that in full RAW, what you then do is select the RAW within the iPad app and download the full RAW via Wi-Fi to the iPad. It's set up like that so that if you're shooting quickly, you can still get your RAW previews very quickly on the iPad and then look at transferring the RAWs when you've got time. But if that full RAW transfer, if I look at X1D2 to my iPad Pro, which actually would have been a 2019 iPad Pro, that's about 1.25, 1.5 seconds. So obviously tethered is quicker, but it's for a full RAW transfer, it's not too bad.
Okay, and then quickly, David from Australia has asked about GPS data and how to link GPS tagged files to maps.
Okay. Okay, so a couple of options. So, okay, what have I got here? So this is a very old file. Actually, this is a H3D. These are nice captures that were outside our office. So by default, if I go to the browse option here, you can see the GPS coordinates are embedded in the metadata of the actual capture. And that data is available to any application that can read the metadata. So that could be, Photoshop, could be Lightroom, no problem. Now, from within Phocus, you have the ability to trigger Google Maps. So if you choose Option, Command, and M, in my case, it will then launch. I just need to bring Google Earth up onto the screen that I'm sharing. So if I just exit photo, just to give you an idea. Sorry, this is probably a bit. So then it'll give you a complete link there to Google Maps. And obviously down here, you've got the fact that we're located in the UK. So I can very quickly move out just to prove the point. So there we are. That's the office basically. Now, just to prove that these work within Lightroom, if I just quickly close Google Earth, and bear with me while I launch Lightroom, just to prove that the Lightroom can actually work with the same information. just quickly import those files. Right, there we go. Hopefully you can see that now. So same files that I was just working on Phocus, and if you look, yep, let's just, yep. So I select one file, and if I click on map, automatically it tells me where those captures are. So in this case, it's our office in the heart of the Chilterns there. And again, you've then from within Lightroom, you've got access to all of the usual functionality there in terms of zooming in and all the relevant types of mapping. Okay, so again, that's another difference between Lightroom and Phocus. Lightroom has a map built in and various support functions there. Phocus, you have to, with the Option or Alt key, depending on whether you're using a thing, Option, Command, and then M for map. On my Mac, that launches then Google Earth, and the physical location is shown that way.
Okay, great. And that's a good way to finish, I think. I think basically the thing with Lightroom and Phocus, it's a personal preference, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. It all depends on what works for you. As I say, my personal workflow is pretty much the hybrid. I use Phocus to do the quick corrections, use the lens corrections that I know are going to be best. Within the adjustment browser, I know that within the exposure tool, I'm using the version 3 algorithms. I've got the dynamic lens corrections, so that works for me in the type of work that I shoot. I then export it as 16-bit TIFFs, and then they get added to my Lightroom catalog. And then I jump backwards and forwards between Lightroom and Phocus to finish off. Photoshop to finish off, and then export my finished files.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Chris.
No problem.
So we'll end it there. As I say, we've overrun a little bit. So if you have any other questions on Phocus that we didn't answer today, please feel free to register again for the next one next month on the 25th of August, and submit your question there. And again, we'll pick sort of some of the the more popular and relevant questions. Try and cover as many as possible. And then once you exit the webinar, you should get a feedback sort of survey pop up. It'd be very much appreciated if you can help fill that in, just to help provide us with how we're doing and what you'd like to see more of. It's all really good feedback. Again, another reminder that today's webinar has been recorded, and we'll hopefully be posting it to our YouTube channel later today, or worst case by tomorrow morning. And all our other webinars are on there as well. So if you missed the first Phocus Q&A webinar we did last month, the topics we covered there, that's on there, as well as lots of interviews with photographers and other technology based webinars on the cameras. And then for anything Hasselblad related, of course, visit hasselblad.com. We've got all our events listed on there, and sort of events around the world, all of our products, all our partner network, lots of inspirational stories from photographers using our cameras, lots on our history. You can request a demo and also get any support that you may need. So thanks very much for joining us again. Hopefully it's all been useful for you, and we'll look forward to hopefully welcoming you to another webinar again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.